All right, good afternoon, everybody. You can keep finding your seats and we'll get started. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and I just want to say a brief word of welcome to get us started. Welcome to AI, and welcome to a conversation on American civic culture. It's our great pleasure to co-host this session this afternoon with the Chautauqua Institution on a subject that is really central to our work and to their work in some very important ways, and to the work of our friends from Brookings and from Johns Hopkins, who we're lucky to have in conversation with us today. Our subject is really the preconditions for a free society in some important respects. AI, like Brookings and like a lot of what happens in Washington, is focused on public policy. We're a public policy institution. But in some ways, and especially in the last few years, it's become apparent that the kind of traditional public policy work that we do has trouble getting heard in an environment that's really characterized by something like a broken political culture, where it's difficult really to have the sorts of debates that our work tries to feed into and to sustain and to drive. And something more fundamental is at issue than the direction of public policy, something that has to do with the character of the country, even with the character of our society, and that requires us to think about what it takes for American democracy to work and what's required institutionally, culturally, for the kind of society we want to really be sustained from one generation to another. And that's a subject that's hard to get your head around, that's hard to get your arms around, but that there's no choice but to take up these days. And it's very much our subject this afternoon. I'm going to let Deborah Senior-Moore of Chautauqua really introduce our speakers and our subject in a little more detail. But my job is really just to welcome you, and in addition to that, I want to thank you for taking the time to think through these questions with us, for being here with us. And I want to thank our friends at Chautauqua for suggesting this idea and for bringing it together. So welcome, and let me turn things over to Deborah.
Thank you, Yuval, and good afternoon, everyone. We're so appreciative of American Enterprise Institute hosting us today. I first came to this beautiful venue a few years ago as part of a leadership cohort that AEI often puts together, and it's wonderful to be back. They've been such great partners for Chautauqua, and we look forward to much more. It is a privilege for us to partner not only with the American Enterprise Institute, but also the Karsh Institute of Democracy. The seeds for today's conversation began with the Chautauqua Perry Fellowship in Democracy. This was an initiative that we launched in 2024, which was Chautauqua's 150th anniversary, our sesquicentennial. And I'm happy to say that the Perrys, Paul and Marnette Perry, are here today, and I'd like to recognize them. Today's moderator, Melody Barnes, is one of our two inaugural Chautauqua Perry Fellows in Democracy. She and New York Times columnist David French have helped us over the past year to launch this new expression of Chautauqua's mission that reinforces our commitment to fostering democratic engagement by strengthening the intellectual and emotional capacities required for active citizenship and democratic participation. We've been leaning into this more and more, and when Melody approached our Chautauqua team about co-hosting a DC event, we said yes, and we immediately called AEI. We want to extend our thanks to our friend, President Robert Doar, for his encouragement, and we are also grateful and proud to note that AEI and Brookings Institution are partners with us for a week this summer at Chautauqua, and it's a week on the future of the American experiment. Please find myself or my colleague Jordan Steves over here if you would like to find out more about this after our program today. The invitation to today's program stated, "The strength of our democracy depends on a civic culture that sustains it." And what a powerful statement. For 150 years, from our grounds in Western New York, which is a very rural area, Chautauqua Institution has created interdisciplinary and intergenerational experiences that deepen our understanding of the issues that shape our world. Our vision calls us to create an informed, engaged, and renewed public that fosters and actively contributes to a more civil society. And we keep trying. We asked Melody to serve as one of our inaugural Chautauqua Perry Fellows because of her lifelong commitment to this same purpose. As founding executive director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy at University of Virginia, Melody is guiding the organization on an action-oriented path to realizing democracy in both principle and practice, drawing on her more than 25 years of experience crafting public policy. We are so pleased to welcome Melody as a keynote speaker at Chautauqua last summer, along with David French, and she will join us again at Chautauqua in June for our second Forum on Democracy. And of course, we're so grateful for the role she played in shaping today's esteemed panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. E.J. Dionne, the W. Averill Harriman Chair in American Governance at Brookings Institution and columnist at The Washington Post. William A. Galston, the Ezra K. Zilka Chair in Governance Studies at Brookings Institution. Hari Hahn, Director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And you've already heard from the wonderful Yuval Levin, Senior Fellow, Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy, and Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here at AEI, and author of the 2024 book, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. And Yuval's wonderful colleague, Christine Rosen, an AEI Senior Fellow and columnist for Commentary Magazine. Thank you all for lending your talents, experiences, and insights to today's conversation. And with that, please welcome our moderator, Melody Barnes.
First of all, I want to thank all of you who are here with us today and willing to engage in this conversation with us, as well as those who are joining us online. And Deborah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and the support of the Chautauqua Institution, and certainly to the Perrys for your support and the honor of serving as one of the inaugural Perry Fellows. And to Yuval and to Christine as well, thank you for your generosity and for hosting us today, along with this, what I call a dream team panel for this conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and my colleagues at the Karsh Institute as well. When we began thinking of today's conversation, the seed for this is the fact, quite frankly, I have spent so much time working in democratic institutions. I've spent time working in the House and the Senate and the White House. And when we think about democracy, we often rightly focus on those very, very important institutions. The Congress, the courts, as well as institutions on the state and local level. In addition to that, we often think about democratic practices like voting, absolutely essential to the work of our democracy. What I often find is that we spend less time having robust conversations about our political culture. And at the same time, I believe, and it'll be interesting as we have our conversation and engage with you, what your thoughts are, that culture sits upstream from the work of institutions and our democratic practices. It serves as the source for our values and principles and ideas, the unspoken rules and norms that often guide our work, the way that we engage with one another, the way that we think about each other as citizens, as we think about residents, and also the way that our political work is oriented. So it is absolutely important. What we want to do today is to have a conversation about that culture and what it means in particular at this point in time, and how it interacts, how it interfaces with our democratic institutions. So that's the goal of today's conversation. And I thought, Christine, that I would start with you, not just because you are furthest away from me on this wonderful row of people, and ask you to start with a description of the state of our culture today and what that means for the strength or the fragility of American democracy today.
Thank you. I don't want to be a pessimist. Maybe that's why you did start with me, because we'll get progressively more optimistic. What worries me the most about even the idea of talking about a common culture is that I'm not sure we have one anymore. If you think about the old days where you could talk about highbrow culture, high art, middlebrow culture, popular culture, people might argue about what was important and what wasn't, but there was a shared idea of what that meant. What I worry about today is that our culture, in terms of the formative institutions through which people consume it, namely screens, has become so fractured that there isn't even enough of a shared reality in many cases for us to agree on terms before we have those debates. And I think we certainly see this in our politics, where a lot of really complicated issues are fought via meme war on X, rather than in any sort of deliberative sense, where young people, I think, often encounter government in a way that is very flippant, not at all grounded in civics, if they are even lucky enough to be in schools that are still teaching them civics. So the pursuit of a common culture, I was thinking about, we have wonderful documents in our history that talk about truth, and we know what these truths, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The phrase that is extremely popular nowadays is my truth. And coming to some understanding of how we get back to these truths from my truth or from my experience or from my reality from which I can avoid hearing or listening or debating with other people about things I disagree with. That, I think, is very important, particularly for younger people who have not been raised with a sense of chronological history of what comes before, what might come after, and who are, unfortunately, quite skeptical of the ability of our government to do things that matter for them. So the mistrust that we often talk about, the concerns about mistrust in institutions, which Yuval, more than anyone else, has written about so brilliantly, all of that starts with what our formative character-building institutions are. And right now, for the young, those are the screen.
Well, Christine, you said that you started out with a pessimistic view, and I encourage members of the panel to jump in. But EJ, I want to turn to you to find out if you are any more optimistic than Christine in her characterization of her concerns, and just putting that in a little bit more of a context. Certainly the story of our country, almost 250 years old, is not a straight line. There have been moments of expansion, of human freedom, and moments of contraction. There are moments of growth and opportunity and moments of contraction, and the list goes on. But we had, and I think Christine was referring to this, something that allowed us to work together to work through those periods so that we could come out on the other side. Again, not a straight line. And what I'm curious about goes to a point that our colleague James Davison Hunter at UVA often makes, and I know Christine has a relationship with his institute as well, which focuses on the fact that we have had these periods of a working through drawn upon our culture. But at this point, it seems as though what allowed us to work through these challenges has been replaced by a sense of resentment or injury across the board, left to right. Our culture has been depleted of those sources that allow us to have the tools to work through our challenges. And I'm wondering, what's your reaction to that? And again, more or less pessimistic than Christine?
Sorry.
Well, thank you for that. A friend once accused me of being a feliciopath, which is a great term, and it means looking for hope, finding hope even when the situation is hopeless. I have to say that the last few months have reminded me a lot of John McCain's great line that things always go dark before they go completely black. I do think there is a lot of that. By the way, I want to thank Chautauqua. Yuval tells us about the importance of institutions. The survival and thriving of Chautauqua as a tradition as well as an institution is extraordinary. And Melody, it's such a joy to be with you. Thank you for what Karsh has done. I think perhaps a source of hope is to understand that this problem with our political culture didn't come from nowhere. It's not like we had a flawed political culture and it led to these problems. I think we really have to focus on how many shocks the system has had in the last 25 years. And I think about this a lot in terms of people who are 35 and under and the kind of America that they have had to live to. And it's such a long list that I wanted to make sure I didn't forget them. 2001, 9/11, followed by endless wars, followed by the economic meltdown of 2008, the rise of Donald Trump and the radicalization of the Republican Party, the pandemic, and thank you to Sam Pressler for making me add this to my list, the opioid epidemic, which has shattered so many of our communities, long-term rise of inequality, whether you start in 1980 or start in 2001 with the accession of China to the WTO, at a regional as well as an individual level, the sense of disempowerment that so many communities that have been stuck in those problems feel. And I think that the rise, what is the crisis in our political culture? It's a rise in mistrust. I think the bred by these failures, decreased confidence in institutions, the decline of civil society institutions that bond people together across lines of difference, from trade unions to religious congregations to local journalism, which I think is underrated as a community builder. Connections online have obviously not replaced these, and we can talk about how in some ways they've aggravated them. Now, I think that we thus can't think of the political culture as an abstract problem. If we think of them in terms of all these shocks and all these problems, I think that it might lead us to sort of separate out two things: the immediate crisis we face now, and the threat to democracy that I think is real. Bill Galston had a great column today, and I salute him for smuggling the word plenipotentiary into a major daily newspaper. And that somehow we have to deal with the immediate crisis we confront now. But all of these problems require us to rebuild on so many different levels. But I guess since I've been assigned the hopeful chair, I think that once we see this as some deep problems that we have confronted, rather than some deep flaw in all of us as a people, we can begin to say, if we deal with some of these problems, we can begin to rebuild a political culture that works better than the one we're confronted with now.
Hari, you signaled that you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to build on EJ's hopeful note and put it maybe in a slightly different way. But also, let me just also start by thanking Melody and thanking all of our hosts for organizing this conversation, which I do think is really important because we don't have enough opportunities to talk about culture. And I think one way to think about it is this question of like, well, what are we talking about when we talk about culture? Mm-hmm. And when you ask this question about where does my hope come from, I think I share your sense of tempered hope, if that's a fair way to characterize it. But one of the things I always say is the closer I get to people living their lives in communities across America, the more hopeful I feel, right? And the more that I am ensconced in conversations in our political institutions, probably the less hopeful that I feel. And so what that tells me is that when I get out and I'm talking to, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and my parents still live there. I still have a lot of friends there. And I'm talking to the kids that I grew up with for whom like politics is a total sideshow, in the circus of their everyday lives, then I feel like there are actually really common sets of questions and aspirations that undergird a lot of people's lives. And so I don't disagree at all, Christine, with what you were saying. I think you're right that the information environments that we live in are so fractured, the political environments that we live in are so fractured, but the kind of assumptions and frameworks I think that people have about what they're aspiring to is not that distinct. But the challenge, and I think actually I love a quote. I use the quote Yuval, something that you've written all the time. Where Yuval writes about the idea that the challenge in politics is how do we get people to act together, even if they're not thinking alike. And so we want to respect the liberty of people to have distinct values and aspirations and things like that. But there has to be some kind of shared commitment to figuring out how to solve these problems together. And so to me, this question of commitment and whether or not we have that shared commitment is really central to the question of culture. And I think it is really fractured, and the sources of where that commitment are coming from are becoming more and more atrophied. But I think for most people, they do want to solve problems in their lives. And so the question is, how do we build on what's there to expand it?
Well, and I'm going to turn to Bill, who also signaled he wanted to jump in. But I'm also wondering if Hari and Christine, if in many ways you're not that far apart. And I want to come back to this later in our conversation too, but Hari, as you talk about what you find on the local level when you get closer to the ground, and Christine, having read some of your writing and listened to some of your interviews, you talk a lot about the importance of the face-to-face and the human experience, that the closer people can be in proximity to one another, that it might be the point or a source for the rebuilding of the kind of culture or the commitment to culture and solidarity in that way that we've been talking about.
Hari's going to make me an optimist because she's absolutely right about that, because that's the kind of change that happens often face-to-face, small groups, organically from the ground up. My concern still remains with how, when you start trying to actually implement some change in your community, you then come into contact with government. And what kind of leaders are we sending, even at the local level? What reward system have we built in for them in terms of how they deal with constituents? Because I think some of our most well-known congresspeople right now don't have constituents anymore. They have followers. And I worry that even at the local level, people get very frustrated. You can go and testify at a city council hearing, but do you actually have access to the person you elected? And so that sort of community, it sounds very old school, but it is how problems get solved at the local level, and making sure we don't outsource to the internet platforms the stuff we really should be doing face-to-face.
Bill?
Yeah, I think it's a sign of a good conversation that when I listen to people speaking, things start popping in my head. This has already done that. So let me just take a minute to share actually just one idea. Yuval, you used the phrase, the preconditions of a free society. And Melody, you referred to, and I quote, something that allows us to work through our challenges. And I have a thought about that. And it's a thought that I've carried around with me since graduate school, when I first encountered the work of Richard Hofstadter, the great intellectual historian. And towards the end of his book on the progressive historians, he reflected on exactly the issue that the two of you put on the table. And here was his answer, which focused on the word comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y. Comity, he said, exists in a society to the degree that those enlisted in its contending interests have a basic minimal regard for each other. One party or interest seeks the defeat of an opposing interest on matters of policy, but at the same time seeks to avoid crushing the opposition, denying the legitimacy of its existence or values, or inflicting upon it extreme and gratuitous humiliations beyond the substance of the gains that are sought. Basic humanity is not forgotten. Civility is not abandoned. The sense that a community life must be carried on after the acerbic issues of the moment have been fought over and won is seldom far out of sight. An awareness that the opposition will someday be the government is always present. I can't improve on that. What Hofstadter
called foundational, the basic minimum regard that we have for each other. And as I read this quote, I was reminded of the ending of Abraham Lincoln's less famous first inaugural address. When he said in his peroration, "We are not enemies, but friends." But then he went on in a pleading tone, "We must not be enemies." And we know how that plea worked out. And the question is, how far away are we from regarding one another as enemies, right? Because if that happens, then this basic mutual minimal regard that Hofstadter talks to has disappeared, and there's no moving back. And to the extent that we have lost that, how can we begin to regain it? That's not a rhetorical question. I don't know, but we must.
Yuval, I couldn't tell you if you looked like you wanted to say something.
Sure, I agree with Bill. This is a conversation that sparks a lot of thinking. One thing that comes to mind, I've been working in one way or another with Christine for 20 years now, and one of the things I like most about it is that it makes me feel like an optimist. I think that in beginning from the premise that that America may be at the edge of the abyss, which I think is a plausible premise, we're operating in a long American tradition. Just about every generation of Americans has assumed that this may be the end. And one of the peculiar characteristic things about our country is this sense that we're just not sure this can be sustained, because what's required to sustain it is so difficult. And it seems like our forefathers were so much better at it than we are, that this feels like an end. This is a country whose national anthem is not about how glorious and beautiful it is. It's about barely surviving the night. It's a song that says the flag was still there is the great achievement. And the question for us always is the flag still going to be there in the morning? That is a question worth asking in this moment. But I also think that we should take some hope from the fact that in one way or another, every generation of Americans has had to confront the possibility that we may not be up to what our fathers and mothers were up to. And ultimately, in one way or another, every generation did manage to rise to the challenge of sustaining this extraordinary society for its own children and grandchildren. And the way in which we might do that, I think, has to begin from a sense of constrained expectations. I'm a conservative. I have low expectations. I don't think everything is going to turn out great all by itself. I think we're going to confront a lot of problems, and that they're rooted in the nature of the human person. In that sense, maybe I differ a little from the way, at least, that EJ phrased his point. I do think the problem is with us, but the problem is always with us. And the way in which we might deal with problems that are with us is through the framing and forming of culture and of institutions that help us contend with the darker realities of human nature. And that means that we have to find ways to deal with the fact that it's always hard to live in a free society, a society just packed with people I disagree with, and that the difficulty of doing that is the great challenge of a genuinely free society, but that it is an achievable challenge. The fact that our country is as old as it is, Americans love to think of ourselves as a young country, and we're, in a way, more energetic than old Europe and so forth, but our regime is older than theirs, much older than most of theirs. It is the oldest living democracy, and it has been around long enough that we can take some solace from what it has been through and what it has allowed us to get through. To sustain it requires us to understand the sources of its strength, some of which are ideas, some of which have to do with a joint history that we have lived together, some of which have to do with the structure of institutions, which is not the same as ideas. I think all of that adds up to a culture that we can be proud of passing along to the next generation. But passing it along is hard work, and that is the work. That's, I think, ultimately the challenge we face. It's why, for me, a focus on civics matters now. A focus on education matters immensely. A focus on institutional health matters. I think of culture as being a kind of sum of all of that. To describe a problem and say, well, what's needed is culture change, if I find myself saying that, I feel like I'm saying, I don't know what to do, because I don't know how to change the culture. But ultimately, the answer to how to change the culture begins from institutions that are at the ground level, as everyone in one way or another has said. The places where we actually operate, where we belong, where we're known to other people, where we make a difference, are institutions, our family, our church, our school, our work, our community. And in those places, how we behave, how we act, how we think, how we speak, how we help other people see the future really matters. And that's what forming culture ultimately amounts to. I think that makes the challenge more achievable, more attainable, but it also means that it's very broad, that everybody has a part, and that the kinds of problems we're talking about here, how do we even have a common culture? How do we even have a shared set of aspirations and ideas? Is enormously challenging. I don't think we can pretend to have an answer, but I do think we can take some hope from the fact that this has never been easy, and it certainly hasn't gotten, we aren't the generation that faces the hardest challenge in the history of our country.
Could I just
Maybe that's
briefly defend my view of human nature? Because oddly enough, I share your view, as you might know. I am a follower, a fan of Reinhold Niebuhr, and even though he got the line from someone else, I've always been fond of his line that original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church, which is to say that there are deep flaws in human nature, that human beings are capable of great sin and also capable of salvation and renewal. So I don't disagree with your view of human nature being a constant problem we have to deal with. I think we have gone through more radical challenges at some points in our history than others. And and this is not an optimistic thought, for about 10, 15 years now, I've spent more time than I had before reading about the 1850s in our history. And the period that we are going through, and even more so now, really reminds me of the 1850s in the nature of our divisions, in the nature of our mistrust, in the role of race and racism in these divisions, in the way in which people behaved on Capitol Hill, where we had the January 6th events. We had violence in the Capitol before the Civil War. And I think there are kind of two periods we might learn from. One is that Civil War period, and how can we avoid reaching all the way to a civil war? And then how can we avoid the rollbacks that happened during Reconstruction, which this feels, again, very similar to that period where we had the second Reconstruction with civil rights, and it feels like there's a rollback there. The other great crisis was the Great Depression. And that was a case where, with an awful lot of suffering and an awful lot of difficulty, democratic government, small d, actually triumphed over the Depression. And we can argue about what FDR did and didn't. I'm maybe more sympathetic to FDR's achievement than some people in this building we are sitting in. But I think that it was a case of democracy actually working. And that was, just one last point, FDR's program was designed to solve immediate problems, but it was also about various forms of empowerment, whether it was through the Tennessee Valley Authority that lifted up a whole region, or the Wagner Act, which empowered workers. And he combined sort of solving immediate problems with forms of empowerment. And it seems to me, how can we have the second solution out of our problems rather than the one that happened starting in 1861?
Can I say just a word? I agree with a lot of that. I think that if we're looking at historical analogies, one other that I would point to that I keep coming back to now is the end of the 19th century, the 1880s and 90s, which was, like our own time, a peculiar kind of 50-50 period in our politics where we had two minority parties simultaneously for an extended period And you can look at that period and say, what were they even arguing about? What really was the debate? That was easy to see in the 1850s. In the 1880s and 90s, the parties basically operated as if the other party was the country's biggest problem. And it was very hard to say exactly what they were supposed to be debating and what really were the questions they were trying to resolve. And in a way, the achievement of the progressive movement, which also we may differ about some of its particular views, the achievement of it was to define the questions. What are we actually disagreeing about? I think there is room now for a political movement in America that could help us to organize our politics around 21st century challenges. Because for all that our politics is contentious and divisive and intense, and it is all of that, we are living in a period of two minority parties who neither of which can see a bigger problem than the other. And they're both approaching the country saying, if they win, then everything's over. Okay, but what else? What are you offering? Why should I vote for you? Is a question you could plausibly ask either party at any moment in the last 20 years. And I think in that sense, we have something to learn from the way that that period ended and that American politics found its way into the 20th century.
And might also speak to the cynicism bordering on nihilism of a younger generation that thinks both parties are equally useless. And they're more registered independents or if they participate in elections at all. And so I think that's a really crucial point if we think about the future health of democracy. Not only do they understand what our system is and how it should work in its history, but do they care enough to actually invest in a list of ideas and challenges and how to face them? Because many, many young people they're very, very cynical about politics at a time when we actually need their energy and optimism.
Well, and as part of that, the kind of a pox on all their houses in terms of the institutions that I would venture to guess many of us in this room, maybe not everyone here or listening, believe are important to our democracy, believing, and it's not just Congress and the courts, but it's also religion and it's the military. I mean, it's literally all of those institutions that many people have a burn it all down kind of reaction to. And I'm curious, you've all a few minutes ago were talking about this is a difficult moment, but there have been other difficult moments. And I'm reminded of the fact that Jefferson and Madison, and they were quite discouraged as they reached the end of their lives. Would this go on? Would this nation mature? And that was after an effort to put together the institutions and to put together the checks and balances that would allow democracy to work in their view. And I'm curious, Yuval, because I know. I believe, I know, you correct me, that you're very kind of Madisonian in nature and believing that institutional culture helps to shape political culture. And if we can get some of the reforms correct in our institutions that will allow us to ask and answer some of the questions that you were describing, that would allow us to move forward. And I'm curious, the time that you've spent in the White House, you've spent time in Congress, Bill also having spent time in the White House as well, others of you studying this, covering it. What reforms do you think might help move us forward? And do we have the ability, and I think some of our other panelists were describing this, to work through these challenges, to productively disagree in a way that would allow those reforms to take hold, to be durable, to be sticky, to even get to them? So I'm curious about the institutional reform and its ability to stick and work.
Yeah, it's not an easy question, of course. I do think, I tend to approach that question in a way that I take to be Madisonian, which is to say that I start from the sense that institutional structure shapes political culture. That's not to say that it shapes all culture, but that the culture of our politics is inevitably filled by men and women who are very ambitious, who want to succeed. And the question is, what is the definition of success? That question is answered by the structure of our institutions. What it takes to succeed is a question that's answered by how Congress works, how the presidency works, how the party system works. That's how these ambitious people define their own success or failure. And I think we're in a peculiar place now where that definition in the minds of a lot of American politicians isn't particularly well connected to the aims of the institutions. They understand success in terms that are super political, that are about having a place in the larger circus of the political entertainment complex, rather than understanding success in terms that have to do with moving legislation, if you're a member of Congress, or with a certain kind of administration. Reconnecting politicians with the institutions they're part of, reconnecting individual ambition with institutional ambition is a lot of the work that needs to be done now. I think it's work that needs to be done especially in Congress, because the absence of institutional ambition is especially serious in Congress now. We're going to spend a lot of time in the next 4 years talking about presidential power and judicial power, because we're going to witness a lot of titanic clashes between the president and the courts. But a lot of the reason for that has to do with the dog that isn't barking, has to do with the vacuum created by the fact that Congress is not doing its job. And it's often harder to see what is not happening. I think it's very, very important now in American political life to see what is not happening. And a lot of what is not happening is what's supposed to be at the core of our national politics, which is congressional action, legislative action. How to change that, I think, has a lot to do with institutional incentives, with the kinds of structural incentives that politicians face in Congress. Some of it is a matter of reforming the party system, and especially the ways in which the parties select candidates. The primary system is just a very bad fit with 21st century American political culture. It's not new. Primaries have been used to choose congressional candidates, I mean, in much of the country for 100 years now, but it's a particularly bad fit for our moment. We're in a situation where the people in America who least want to see the system work are the ones we first ask, who do you want to see in the system in every election cycle? And that means we end up with people who aren't going to enable the system to work, and we need to think about that. The parties have to see that they're failing, which oddly enough, neither party really quite grasps that it has been failing consistently for 25 years. They both have, because neither of them has built a durable majority in a generation. Neither of them quite sees it because they're just barely losing elections. And parties really learn lessons when they lose big. Neither of them feels like it has lost big in a long time. They both think, well, I don't know, let's run the guy who lost last time and maybe he'll win. And then he does win. And we're left in a place that it is very hard to emerge from. Some of the changes, though, I think, require institutional change in Congress. Empowering the committees more than we now do, thinking about the budget process in a different way than we now do. These are very mundane ways to get at the kinds of big questions we're talking about. The breakdown of our political culture doesn't feel like it could be addressable by changing the committee system in the House. And I would not suggest that it can be solved that way. But I think that some of the most significant drivers of dysfunction could be mitigated some by changing the incentives that people in the political system face, so that we can channel the frustration of the public in the direction of political action. Right now, that frustration gets channeled in the direction of a greater and greater cynicism about the system. There's a sense that it can never work, and everything that happens is further proof that it can never work. If instead the fact that we're having trouble getting what we want led us to build broader coalitions, which is the way to get anything done in American politics, I think we'd be in a little bit of a better place to help our system work. And getting there could be helped by the kinds of reforms that those of us who think about political reform work on.
Bill, I'm curious, particularly given the conversation we were having even before we walked in the room, your thoughts about institutions and institutional reform. And others, certainly please jump in, but I also want to draw in Hari and Christine with a little bit of a twist on the what next. What do we do question.
Well, like Yuval, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Madisonian. And I'm not sure whether I'm like Yuval in what I'm about to say. And that is, I am less confident than I was 30 years ago about the efficacy of institutional reform right now in addressing our most fundamental ills. And I say that, well, let me let me just take as my point of departure what Yuval was just talking about. If you ask why it is that the Congress of the United States can no longer do its job, why some colleagues of mine, once called it the broken branch. I would say that the heart of its brokenness is the inability to forge broader coalitions through compromise, right? In an era of closely divided political parties, not just deeply divided, but closely divided, well, that was dramatic, there are two alternatives, compromise or gridlock. And, at the beginning of each administration, there may be a burst of policymaking on the basis of a unified party of the president. That quickly goes away, and then we're back to gridlock. And why are we gridlocked? Why is compromise so difficult? Well, I'm afraid the answer goes back to something that everybody talks about and is a cliche, but is true, namely that the parties are deeply divided. And it is that deep division that makes compromise so much more difficult than it used to be. Why are the political parties more deeply divided than they used to be? Well, over the past 40 years, as everybody has written, there's been a sorting out of the political system. We now have a liberal party and a conservative party. This was not always the case. We now have 90% of the House of Representatives dominated by either safe red districts or safe blue districts. This was not always the case. As a number of people have pointed out, with political polarization has come a geographical segmentation, right? That people, conservatives who live in liberal states or even liberal congressional districts are increasingly uncomfortable there. And so they tend to move to places where more people think like them. One journalist turned sociologist called this the big sort. And so, yeah, improvements in the primary system would be desirable, and I support them. But in congressional districts that are 80% red or 80% blue, and there are a lot of them, I am skeptical about the efficacy of primary reforms to generate fundamentally different results. But let me switch for just 1 second and make a different point. Then I'll yield the floor, or yield back the balance of my time, which is probably negative. And that is, although it is the case, Melody, that culture is upstream from politics, what Daniel Moynihan said in response is very much to the point. Yeah, culture is upstream from politics, but politics can transform culture. And right now we're seeing a big attempt on the part of the national government to do just that. You can all fill in the details. I don't need to cite them. But let me give you another example, a more hopeful example. In 1947, 5% of the American people supported mixed-race marriage. In 1967, which is, I believe, the year that the Supreme Court handed down its Loving decision, overturning state laws that forbade mixed-race marriage, the percentage was still well below half. Now it's 95%. 95%. And I would submit that the decision of a major political institution to say, even to a majority of the people, we don't care what you think, this is a fundamental violation of our Constitution, can have over time culturally transformative effects. And I am not without hope, that if our national institutions can figure out a range of interventions that move us in a more hopeful cultural direction, that over time, this vicious cycle might be turned into a virtuous cycle.
There's so much to discuss there. I see, it looks like a couple of you want to jump in.
All of us, why don't we hurry? I'll go last since I intervened. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, so just on this point of or how we think about institutions, is I think we can think beyond our national political institutions as a source of reform. I don't disagree with anything that Yuval and Bill said about the importance of institutions in shaping culture, but Congress isn't our only institution, nor is our federal government the only institution. And one thing I always think about is, I remember my husband and I have been married for over 20 years, but when we first got married, I remember someone said to us, when you fight, you can fight like you want to get divorced, or you can fight like you want to stay married, right? And of course we want to stay married, and so we fight like we want to stay married. So it's not that we don't disagree, right? But forging a common life together is actually really hard work. It's hard work in our families. It's even harder when we expand that to a local, state, national community. And what that means is that then the first order problem that has to be solved in forging a common life together, whether it's in a family or whether it's in a country, is this question of, are we committed enough to keep trying, right? And so where does that commitment come from? And I think here I agree fully with what you've all said, which is that the problems are the humans, right? We're evolutionarily not inclined necessarily to want to think about being committed to working with people who are really different from us. There's all sorts of reasons why we come out of the womb without that commitment, and it's the institutions that we create that should be the wellspring of those kinds of commitments. But those kinds of institutions have been atrophied for a variety of different reasons. Christine pointed on to some of them, but I think there are a lot of other ones over the years. And so one way I think to think about this challenge about what to do next is this idea that if we start from the idea that humans aren't born with the skills they need or the commitments they need to want to do the work of forging a common life together, and the second premise is then the audacious promise, I think, at the heart of liberalism and democracy has always been that if you put people into institutional settings where they are both incentivized and given the opportunity to work with people and learn skills of compromise and the motivations that it takes, then people begin to reach for their kind of Madisonian better angels. And then the third question then is are people given those opportunities? And I think if you look around, then there are challenges both of what I would think of as both distribution and design, right? Distributionally, most people aren't given those opportunities. They might be online, but then the opportunities, the way they're designed online, are terrible. They don't incentivize us at all to act in the ways that we want to. And then in our actual kind of face-to-face communities, a lot of people don't have access to those kinds of opportunities anymore. And so, I was talking with Melody before the talk. I've most recently been doing a lot of work on evangelical megachurches. And this is a place where I think there's a lot more heterogeneity in evangelical churches than most people understand. And a few data points that I'll just throw out that I think kind of give you a sense of this is church attendance in America has gotten so skewed toward large churches, which are not all evangelical, but a lot of them are, so that the top 9% of churches by size in America contain 50% of the church-going population. And the largest megachurches in America, a megachurch is defined as a church that has 2,000 or more members. The average megachurch in America, I think, I don't have exact numbers right, so don't quote me, but something like about 6,000 members, a $5 million a year annual budget, 96% of the budget comes from individual donations, right? So people not only attend, but they fully engage in these churches. The church that I did the most work with is a church in the third largest megachurch in America. It's located in southern Ohio. They get 35,000 people that show up per week, right? And so they outstrip any other political organization that we know about in America. And the average megachurch in America grew by 34% in the last period that we have data, right? So people are flocking towards these churches. They're giving money. They're giving time. And I sort of tell that story to sort of say I think these are important institutions to understand because they're institutions, even if they're not political institutions. and they shape people's understanding of their own, what they're committed to, right? And so even if people aren't getting the kind of political responsiveness from their elected leaders, I think they're getting a sense of their own agency through these kind of civic institutions that they can be a part of. And one of the mottos of this church that I spent a lot of time studying in Ohio is this idea that belonging comes before belief. Right, and that's like, when I first heard that, I was like, wow, it's like they took 50 years of social science research encapsulated it into 4 words, whereas like we've spent, many academic papers like trying to say that make the same point. But the idea was, they would say, look, like no matter what you believe, like we're an evangelical church, we believe in a Christian God, we believe the Bible is literal, we believe, we're not shy about what we stand for, but no matter what you believe, you're a part of our community. And they had this ethos of radical hospitality that welcomed people into it. And it would bring like the broad communities of people in. So the church is about 80% white, 20% non-white. They had pro-Trump, anti-Trump, Republicans, Democrats, pro-gun, anti-gun, like every kind of cleavage in America, those views were held within this community. And so I think that I sort of tell that story by way of saying that I think there's a lot of work that we can do to think about how we design the opportunities and the institutions that we give people access to, and then distribute those more broadly, because I think there's a hunger out there because a lot of people understand the paucity of what we have right now.
Thank you. I wanted you to talk about that as a way or as a lens to think about how we might approach this challenge. Christine, I wanted to turn to you. I know you had something you wanted to say, and you write a lot about the human experience. And you touched on it, but what's missing, what's needed? You talk about I'm going to mess up your quote, but we have disposed of the very human experiences that are necessary for civic engagement. So I'm wondering if you could.
So like Yuval, I'm fascinated by human nature, which is what most conservatives, if they will be honest, confess to that. It's such a puzzle, which we will never solve, which is what makes it so fascinating. I'm also interested in habit formation. And if you look at our popular culture, people are fascinated by their own habits, how to change them, how to improve. Any book about habit becomes a bestseller. But I'm wondering what our civic habits of mind are. How do we create good civic habits? So one reason I think a megachurch would bring so many people in, even if they don't agree on all the doctrinal points of faith, is that there are real civic responsibilities. It's not just that they have rights in the community, they have responsibilities. And I feel like, particularly among the young, there's a real hunger for meaning and purpose. And at the civic level, if they come into contact with government at all, whether the local, state, or federal, it's usually because a problem has happened, something's gone wrong, and they're given one of 2 options. You can complain, or you can do nothing and just shrug your shoulders. There's not really an avenue for fixing the problem. Or if they try to fix it, they often are told, no, we don't need, we're going to take care of the technocrats who know how to do this will do this. And I think that really leaves kids, young people, and even not so young people, having an experience with government that doesn't teach them how to be good citizens. We used to all have a Pledge of Allegiance before. There are all these weird little habits that we fight about, whether culturally we should do them or not, but they were creating habits of mind. So when we think about the civic habits we want to inculcate, the place that those start is with an understanding of history and civics. And I think that's where, at the educational level, just as Yuval said, there are all these reforms that need to happen institutionally in institutions like Congress. At the educational level, we need to find a way to inculcate better civic habits of mind. And if you don't have a shared history, it's very difficult to even understand what that means. So I think looking at ways to, in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, is a pretty great time to do this. Yuval's been leading a wonderful effort with that here at AEI. How do we teach what our country is and means, especially because, as a historian I came of age post-social history revisionism, and I think we do need to constantly revise our country's story, because not everything has been included that should, not every episode has been examined, but it still needs to be a common story. So I would say more history, more civics for kids, more ways of practicing their civic obligations, not just constant reminders about their rights. Rights are important, should be defended, but with them come responsibilities. And I think that's actually where we've fallen behind, particularly educationally.
I'm going to turn to EJ. I want to open it up for questions. I know, Bill, you also have something you want to say, but I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. EJ?
Yeah, first, I want to thank Christine for something you said earlier that I'm going to think about more members of Congress who have followers, not constituents. That's a fascinating, there's a lot there. I want to go all the way back to something Yuval said earlier, where he had a blanket description of Congress not acting. And I'd just like to remind us that it was just 4 years ago that Congress, in a bipartisan way, passed a big infrastructure bill, and Congress, in a bipartisan way, passed the CHIPS and Science Act. You can agree or disagree with it, but it was a major investment and a major turn in our policy. In a non-bipartisan way, they also passed the climate investments. Why do I make this point? Because I think the issue, and I'm sorry to have to be the one to put this on the table, political parties are institutions that shape political culture, and the radicalization of the Republican Party is extremely important to the problem that we are describing. If we had a Yuval Levinist Republican Party, we could have some wonderful arguments. Yuval and I have argued before about healthcare and how to solve it. But I don't doubt for an instant the dedication of Yuval to democratic institutions. Congress has been paralyzed so far because it hasn't been willing to take on the president. I couldn't agree more with both Yuval and Bill in talking about needing a democracy works when we accept that we will lose the next election. One of my favorite book titles is Larry O'Brien, the former Kennedy aide, also former head of the NBA, a successful American institution, I would say, but I'm in a good mood about the NBA because I'm an ardent Boston Celtics fan. But Larry O'Brien's book was called No Final Victories. That is a wonderful idea because no final victories means there are no final defeats. So I utterly agree that's what we seek. But to have someone in power who did not accept defeat, who still doesn't accept a defeat, shapes our political culture. And I just think we have to face that these two parties, Democrats have all kinds of problems, but I don't think these two parties are like the other at this moment in our history. And I'll make a confession that my dirty little secret is I was a teenage liberal Republican. And that's a dirty little secret because you can't be more boring than a liberal Republican as a teenager. So I am not against the Republican Party in principle, but I think that there is a real problem there. Now, last quick point. Yuval, I agree with his raising the progressive era as another really fascinating time when we were coping with quite radical problems, not exactly the same as now, but they were problems of the Gilded Age, concentrated economic power, as well as all kinds of other new problems. But when we talk about revering the Constitution, one of the things the founders were very clear on is that they thought the Constitution should be amended at various points in our history. And we had two great periods of constitutional reform, one after the Civil War with the Civil War amendments, which were like a second founding, as Eric Foner said, and the other was in Yuval's progressive era, where we made some substantial changes. I love associating the progressive era with Yuval, by the way, where we made substantial changes in the Constitution for the direct election of U.S. senators, granting women the right to vote. We've lost our constitutional imagination. We don't even think about the fact that the founders suggested to us that there might be times in our history where we want to revisit their work to make it relevant to a different time. I think we need a period, again, of constitutional imagination. I won't open debate on what I might do, but I do think we need that constitutional imagination back.
Well, it's interesting because that imagination exists on the state level in a way that it doesn't on the federal level. I do want to open the floor. I will start over here. And please let us know, let the room know who you are and ask your question. And I will ask questions until I get the hook.
I'm Alan Rawl, a lawyer and law teacher. So I have one quick rhetorical question and an actual question. The rhetorical question is following up on Ms. Rosen's points about improving our civic habits. Can that really be done if we don't improve the national consensus on basic facts? We have a very polarized view of facts. The actual question is picking up, I think, of what Yuval mentioned about channeling public frustration into action rather than cynicism. Would it be possible for one party to make a gesture to the other party? And I'll put it in concrete terms. What if the Democratic Party in Congress said right now, we'd like to help Donald Trump be successful on something important, such as, let's just say, tariffs, which in order to regularize it would need congressional approval. He's operating now on emergency powers, which is debatable as to its legitimacy. Would it be possible for Democrats to try to channel the frustration into some action and say the best interests of the United States would turn on whether Donald Trump is successful on something, anything? Is that a possible diminution of cynicism and channeling of frustration and inaction and deadlock into something positive?
Yeah, no one wants to.
I like your first question.
And it has certainly happened before,
Right.
In other instances.
Yeah,
For
I think
many
the
reasons,
way
can
it's
happen
happened
now.
before is worth thinking about. It wouldn't have to be an act of unilateral goodwill, right? The idea is we will let you achieve something if in return we can achieve something too. And I think that's both more imaginable and more practical. Obviously, both parties face very high obstacles now to working with each other. Those obstacles are put up by their most devoted voters, the primary voters, to whom most members feel most accountable in both parties. And that makes it very hard to cooperate in any way, because the people who least want cooperation are the ones who have the most leverage over elected officials. I think the only way to change that is by showing your most devoted voters that the only way to achieve anything they want is by building coalitions. Pick the issue that matters to you, whatever it is, and I will show you how you will never get what you want unless you're willing to give the other party something too. And so I think that sort of bilateral goodwill, which is also bilateral self-interest, is how our system is intended to work and can still work. It is possible to get beyond 50-50 in contemporary American politics. What's lacking for it is the political will, and there are reasons for that, structural reasons, reasons of incentive. But I do think that it's imaginable if we see it not just as unilateral goodwill, but as coalition building.
Yeah. I have a slightly different view of the immediate problem as opposed to the historical record. And I don't intend this as a partisan comment, but simply as an analytical comment. President Trump had a choice at the very beginning of his administration. Was he going to create a space for that sort of thing or not? And he made a clear choice not to. Right? And everything that's happened since has made it more difficult, not less difficult, but more difficult for the leaders of the Democratic Party to take the kind of steps that you're urging on them. And just to radicalize the problem, the president so far has proceeded on a basis that suggests that he can accomplish a substantial portion of what he wants to do without even the support of his own party in Congress, and this new thesis of a plenipotentiary presidency, that is superior, is not only supreme in the executive branch. That's the old problem of the unitary executive, but now claims superiority over both Congress and the judiciary. That creates a whole new ballgame. And I am not optimistic in these circumstances that either party will be able, that the Democrats will be able to take this first step, in much the same way that President Zelensky doesn't think he can afford to take the first step, because guess what? He can't.
Just on that point, I mean, they could go to him and say, stop deporting people illegally, stop firing people illegally, stop telling the IRS to do things a president shouldn't tell the IRS to do, and then maybe we can talk. I would point out that Democrats gave Trump and the Republicans the votes they needed to pass a budget earlier this year. If the Democrats had not done that, we would have gone into a shutdown. So I'm with Bill in his point. I wish we lived in a world where what you're suggesting was possible. I just don't see it right now.
I do just think it's worth saying that this kind of presidentialism was not invented by Donald Trump and is not new in this moment. It is where our system has been headed for a very long time. And the failure of imagination that's involved in coming in and saying, we have a 3-vote majority, so let's do it on our own, is not novel to the current majority. That was the majority last time too, and that was the instinct last time too. It's obviously gotten worse each turn of the screw, and it is worse now than in the previous administration.
Well, wouldn't you agree that the claims, I just want to get that on the table, the claims this president has made go far beyond. I agree presidentialism has grown over a long period of time.
They go beyond in the same direction as
way
the claims
beyond the
every
earlier
one of our
norms.
presidents has been making in the 21st century. They certainly do go beyond. But I think we've been moving in a presidentialist direction that is bad for our system under both parties for a generation. And obviously, it worries me more and more all the time. And I certainly think that Donald Trump is doing it at a level that we have not seen before. I would not suggest otherwise, but in a direction that we have been seeing for a while.
Let's see, this woman here.
Hi, thanks. My name's Carolyn Fanaroff. Thanks for this awesome panel and for having a little piece of Chautauqua here in DC. My question is, the formative character building institution that Ms. Rosen talked about, and then the development of comity and how we build them together, because otherwise I'm looking for a path out of despair. In other words, what are we looking to for the future? What are we talking to our kids about? I have young adult kids, and they're very involved in politics, but they're also thinking about their future. And so they don't look at the world the same way that I do because they have different experiences. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of, and then also the megachurches as one of those institutions, if you could comment about that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll take one piece of that and say, I think right now we're being offered a couple of paths. One, you do see from the sort of big tech right that's arisen recently, which is let's make government more like Silicon Valley. Let's make your experience of everything seamless, efficient. You don't want to be bothered with the details of how governance works. They're so slow. The bureaucracy is so terrible. We'll make an app for that, basically, shorthand. That's very bad, because that speaks to this issue of responsibilities and rights. And I think part of being a good citizen is doing stuff you might not otherwise enjoy doing, like educating yourself about the candidates in your local, state, and federal elections so that you can go and cast your vote both in a primary election and in a general election. Really trying to read both sides of any issue, because you might assume you know one thing, but in fact, someone else's view is worth entertaining. And then the most important thing, creating spaces that are not virtual, where virtual platforms are designed to bring our attention and immediate visceral response, fear, anger, anxiety. Not happiness, not comity, not any of those things. And they reward short-term immediate thinking, not long-term deliberative thinking. So finding places, civic spaces, where we can have those sorts of discussions. I mean, it's great that this is an event co-sponsored with Chautauqua. The history of Chautauqua is creating that sort of space, not just in upstate New York, but all over the country throughout its history. I spoke at Chautauqua a few years ago on, said some controversial discussions about free speech. It was one of the most amazing audiences ever. The questions were fiercely on point and really thoughtful and really wonderful. So those sorts of places are what we have to cultivate. We've gotten rid of those. They've just gradually disappeared over time. Places where people who you don't work with, you don't live with because they're not your family members, who might be from a different race, class, religious background, all come together. The third places, sociologists used to call them. Robert Putnam worried about their loss when he wrote Bowling Alone. We have only gone further away from creating those spaces. We can rebuild those kind of spaces. People are hungry for those sorts of spaces.
Hari?
Yeah, I fully agree. And one thing I'll just sort of say is Valerie Bunce is a political scientist who built her career kind of studying Eastern Europe, and there's many definitions of democracy that are out there, but like she has a really, I think, crisp definition of democracy that helps kind of build on what Christine said, which is this idea that democracy is unique among all other forms of government in the sense that it demands that people accept uncertainty over outcome in order to have certainty over process. Right, which I think is just like a really nice encapsulation of this of the reason why these rights and responsibilities are really important, because If you think about like an authoritarian government, it's like we have more certainty over outcome, but you don't know how we're going to get there, right? And so if we're having an election in Russia, we know who the winner is going to be. We just don't know how he's going to accomplish that, right? Now, in our system, right, like we don't know if my side's going to win, right? So I have to be willing to accept the possibility of loss, but I should have guarantees of a certain set of rights and responsibilities that I can know that I will have and that I am willing to give if, in order to kind of be able to fight for the outcome that I care about, right? And I think that like thinking about that and then what are the downstream questions then that raises about what we all need to know and be willing to do in order to live in a system like that and to accept that kind of uncertainty. Like to me, that's the big challenge of the civic education.
Yeah.
Let me 3 quick ideas. Just I think it's a great question. I would love religious institutions that are divided politically to pair with each other and bring their congregations together. Because now our religious institutions are politically polarized. Imagine a conservative church, liberal church, conservative synagogue, liberal synagogue, and so on. Second, we do need more civic education in schools that would include media education. Third, why can we not use the new technologies to help build face-to-face contact? It's been done before. You can use it to organize neighborhoods and bring people together. We talk so much about how technology is wrecking us, and in many ways, Jonathan Haidt has a point, a big point, but I think we can use it more constructively to build the kind of face-to-face contact that Christine talks about.
Bill, last
No,
point.
I'll yield so we can get some more questions in.
I believe I have gotten the hook. Unfortunately, yes, I'm getting the head nodding of the hook. And so I am sorry. Obviously, this is a rich and robust conversation that we could have for much longer. Please join me in thanking, again, the dream team of panelists here.